Ron and I grew up together in a small town in Indiana. He's a good-hearted guy, always the quiet, nerdy type who kept to himself. He's the sort of person who could spend hours getting lost in a book or tinkering with some random gadget. We were an odd pair, him, the shy brainiac, and me, the loud and outgoing type. But somehow, it just worked. We bonded over our shared love for video games, spending countless weekends trying to beat the latest releases. After high school, I enlisted in the military. I'd been involved in JROTC throughout high school, so it felt like a natural step for me. Ron wanted to sign up too, but his dad firmly put his foot down. The early 2000s were rough times, wars in the Middle East were raging, and Ron's dad was adamant about keeping his son out of harm's way. He didn't want Ron ending up as another statistic on the evening news. Looking back, I can't say his old man was wrong. I lost more friends than I care to count in those wars. If Ron had joined, he might have been one of them. But as fate would have it, Ron's path took a different kind of dark turn. He's currently serving over 20 years behind bars, all because of a woman who dragged him into a world of trouble. I often wonder if I could have changed the course of things, maybe stepped in earlier when he first told me about her. Ron called me toward the end of my military service, excited about a new girl he'd met. I remember feeling a pit in my stomach, like I knew something was off, even then. But I kept my mouth shut, thinking it wasn't my place. Now, I wonder if I'm just as much to blame for not stepping in when it mattered. 8 years passed in the military. When my service ended, I came back to a country that felt like a stranger to me. I received an honorable discharge, having spent most of my time in the Middle East. All I wanted was to catch up with my old friend. I called Ron and invited him out for a drink. He'd been busy lately and had already turned me down once, so it was tough to pin him down. We used to catch up during my breaks home, but those visits had grown fewer over time. Ron's life had taken off in ways I hadn't expected. He was now running his own manufacturing company that specialized in high-tech components, and from what I'd heard, business was booming. After high school, Ron went to college, earned his degree in bioengineering, and somehow turned his little startup into a million-dollar enterprise in just a few short years. Meanwhile, I was back home, jobless and with a resume that didn't exactly scream high-paying job. 8 years in the service hadn't prepared me for civilian life, and I was struggling to find my footing. It felt like starting from scratch. Ron, on the other hand, was on top of the world. I didn't resent Ron's success, but I'd be lying if I said it didn't sting a little. He'd always been the one with the brains, the one with the plan. And here I was, trying to figure out my next move. That's why I was so eager to meet up with him. I wanted to pitch the idea of working together, this time at his company. We had talked about it years ago when he first started the business while I was still overseas. Joining forces again had always been in the back of my mind. Now, more than ever, I needed a fresh start, and I hoped Ron might be the key to that. Back when I was still serving in the military, Ron and I had discussed the possibility of me joining his business once I got out. I figured I could help with customer relations and sourcing parts from overseas, especially since he frequently traveled to Asian countries to find vendors for the components his team needed. We'd gone over the idea more than once, and I genuinely believed I could bring something valuable to the table. When I showed up at the bar that day, I was pretty hopeful. I knew he'd flaked on me before, but I was determined to make this meeting count. As I pulled into the parking lot, I saw his car parked right behind mine. Even back then, his business was doing well enough that he was driving the sports car he'd always dreamed of owning. I won't say what kind it was, just to keep things anonymous, but it was one of those cars that turned heads. Seeing it there, I felt a surge of excitement. It had been 2 years since we'd last seen each other, and I was looking forward to catching up. When Ron walked in, I noticed he'd put on about 40 pounds since I'd last seen him. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, and I could tell right away that bars weren't really his scene. Ron wasn't the type to indulge in drinking, which had unfortunately become one of my habits over the years. Still, he'd agreed to meet me, and I took that as a good sign, or so I thought. As we settled in, I tried to steer the conversation toward the job we'd talked about years ago. But Ron dodged the topic like a pro, always changing the subject whenever I brought it up. He seemed much more interested in talking about his wife, Helen, a woman he'd met in China and brought to the U.S. on a spousal visa. About a year earlier, Ron had called me to tell me about Helen shortly after she'd arrived in the States. According to him, they'd met 2 years prior while he was in China scouting suppliers for a component he designed for one of his latest products. Helen had been his translator and liaison during that trip. Before long, she was on his payroll, working remotely from China for about a year before making the move to the US. They had a quick courthouse wedding in China, but Helen wanted the full traditional white wedding experience in the US, something she'd dreamed of since childhood. Ron, being the socially awkward and geeky guy that he is, has a tendency to fall head over heels for any woman who shows him attention. I'd warned him about this before because it never ended well. Naturally, I felt the need to offer some advice about this relationship, too. Something about Helen didn't sit right with me. I thought it was strange that she'd gained so much control over his business so quickly. According to Ron, they co-own the business, with everything split 50-50. Ron also mentioned something that raised another red flag for me. They hadn't been physically intimate yet because Helen wanted to wait until after their big white wedding. To me, that was highly unusual, especially given all Ron had done for her. Here was a woman he'd known for 2 years, who lived with him, legally married him, and had become a major player in his business, and yet they hadn't consummated the marriage. I'm no expert on Chinese culture, but that felt odd. I asked him why they hadn't had the white wedding yet, and he told me it was because her parents were having visa issues. She wanted them to attend the wedding, and the delays were making it impossible to finalize plans. I didn't buy it, and I told him so. If I were in your shoes, I said, she would have given up that celibacy by now. Ron didn't like that comment at all. He got defensive, listing all the reasons she was special, how she was a great business partner, smart, beautiful, and hardworking. I cautioned him about giving her too much control over his business, pointing out that plenty of women possess those qualities, and she wasn't necessarily one of a kind. Ron didn't take my skepticism well. I could tell he was irritated, so I decided to shift the conversation back to the job opportunity. But by then, the damage was done. His mood had shifted, and he seemed less interested in discussing the topic. It felt like the Ron I once knew had changed. Maybe it was his newfound wealth, or maybe he just didn't want to hear my opinions anymore. By the end of our meeting, he half-heartedly promised to think about the idea and let me know after reevaluating his available positions. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the friend I once knew was gone. All that was left was a business-minded guy, completely infatuated with a woman he barely knew and who seemed to be leading him by the nose. Right then, I made a promise to myself: if he offered me a job at his company, I would keep my mouth shut and tell him what he wanted to hear. I'd become a yes man if that's what it took, because I had to look out for myself. 3 days later, Ron called and invited me over to his place. I prepared for that meeting like it was a job interview because, in many ways, it was. Meeting someone who used to be your best friend had never made me so nervous, but I wanted that job badly. I knew better than to say anything that might set him off again. People change, life experiences, money, and other factors can turn your closest friends into strangers. I wasn't even sure if I'd meet Helen that night, but I figured I might, since they lived together. I arrived at Ron's house around 9 or 10 p.m. It was a nice place in a good part of town, nothing too flashy but definitely a step up from where I was. At that time, I was still living with my parents and driving an old car that wasn't worth much, so yeah, the job offer meant a lot to me. When I walked in, Helen greeted me politely, though she seemed a bit reserved. I could see why Ron was so smitten with her. She was beautiful and carried herself with an air of propriety. She even made us Chinese food for dinner. After we finished eating, the three of us moved to the living room with a glass of wine to discuss business. Ron offered me the position of vice president for customer relations and sourcing. I'd have 2 employees reporting to me, making me the 3rd highest ranking person in the company after Ron and Helen. As we talked, I got a better understanding of their business. They had about 10 employees at the time, mostly focused on manufacturing medical equipment and components for various industries. The company engineered and assembled these parts, sourcing all components from Asia. Their business model was highly profitable. They'd patent parts that customers needed for years, effectively becoming the sole supplier. This allowed them to control prices without any competition. I also realized that Helen played a much bigger role in the business than I'd initially thought. She was in charge of supply chain management, customer relations, marketing, and even hiring. Ron, as the company president, handled engineering, quality control, and patents. My role, at least initially, would be more about supporting Helen than working directly with Ron. Helen's English was good, though she had a noticeable Chinese accent. She was stunningly beautiful, only 25 years old, just a couple of years younger than us, and clearly competent. She seemed well connected with suppliers and customers. Ron mentioned that they were fast-tracking my hiring because he and Helen were planning a business trip to China and Vietnam in a few months. They needed someone to manage things on the home front while they were away, and I was more than ready to step into that role. Ron also floated the idea of me joining Helen on her next trip to China. He thought it would be a great chance for me to immerse myself in the business and get introduced to their suppliers. Helen made these trips about every 2 months, so getting involved in that aspect of the company was essential for my role. During our meeting that night, we had more wine, and both Ron and Helen seemed to relax. In hindsight, I could see that Helen was putting on a bit of an act in front of Ron, though her true, more outgoing personality occasionally peeked through. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Even if I had noticed, I wouldn't have said anything. Ron was far too sensitive about anything concerning his wife. About a week later, I officially began my on-the-job training. I was given my own office and quickly started learning the ropes. A couple of weeks in, we were preparing for a big manufacturing expo in Las Vegas. It was set to attract a lot of clients from the medical industry, making it an excellent opportunity for the company to showcase its capabilities. Ron, Helen, another colleague, and I were all set to attend the 3-day event. We'd rented a booth to present our products. I felt fortunate to be included in the trip. It was my first real opportunity to engage with the company's operations outside the office. The expo was scheduled from Wednesday to Friday, and we planned to fly in on Tuesday, with our departure depending on how our meetings went and any free time we might have to explore the city. We arrived in Vegas late Tuesday evening, and all 4 of us checked into the same hotel. Initially, my focus was on marketing materials and setting up our booth, so I didn't expect much downtime to see the city. That night, however, I needed clarification on a few things, so I decided to stop by Ron and Helen's suite to get their input. When I knocked on their door, Ron greeted me and let me in, mentioning that Helen had stepped out for a bit. He was reviewing some designs on his laptop but couldn't answer my questions since they were more in Helen's domain. Wrapping up with Ron, I figured I'd see where Helen had gone. Knowing Ron, he wasn't the type to hang around a bar just to drink, so I assumed she was either handling business or meeting someone. I wandered into the casino downstairs and spotted Helen at the bar, chatting with a man I didn't recognize. As soon as she saw me, she waved me over, inviting me to join them. I sat down, and to my surprise, they immediately started asking my opinion on a horse race being shown on one of the screens. I had zero knowledge of horse racing, and it felt like they were trying to distract me, maybe because I'd caught Helen in a situation she didn't want me to see. At first, I thought nothing of it. She might have been networking, which was the whole point of our trip to Vegas. But as the conversation went on, her demeanor felt off, like she was trying too hard to act casual. Helen and the man were sharing drinks, and there was a hint of flirtation between them that was hard to ignore. When I showed up, the man quickly made his exit, looking a bit disappointed. I decided to shift the conversation back to work and asked Helen about the questions I'd originally come to discuss. By then, she'd had a few drinks, which made her more talkative than usual. We started chatting, and before long, we were discussing her relationship with Ron. To my surprise, she didn't have many positive things to say. She complained that Ron was too focused on work, overly critical, and had rigid expectations of how people should behave. I listened but didn't offer my thoughts on Ron. I'd learned the hard way not to get involved in their relationship. During our chat, Helen opened up about her background. She was born in China as the only child of her parents and raised in a traditional household with strict rules. However, her wealthy uncle, her father's younger brother, had helped her get a good education. She traveled to the U.S. several times as a tourist and eventually graduated college early, working as a liaison between Chinese and foreign companies. That's how she'd met Ron. We talked for about an hour, getting to know each other better as the bar slowly emptied. I felt a growing chemistry between us, something I hadn't expected. To break the tension, I jokingly suggested we should invite Ron to join us, but Helen told me he was already asleep. "This isn't his scene," she said with a chuckle. She was right, Ron wasn't one for late-night bar outings. Still, I couldn't help but feel the tension rising. Feeling overwhelmed by the flirtatious vibe, I excused myself to the restroom, needing a moment to clear my head. We hadn't crossed any lines outright, but there was definitely some mild flirting happening. I might have even been the one who started it, and the alcohol certainly wasn't helping. Splashing water on my face, I knew I was playing with fire. Ron was my best friend and my boss, and this was his wife. I didn't want to risk everything I'd worked for over this. At least, that's what I told myself. When I returned, another man had approached Helen and was trying to chat her up. He quickly backed off when he saw me coming back. Sitting down next to her, I couldn't help but really look at her. She was undeniably stunning, easily a 9 or 10. I made a lame comment about the music, suggesting we should dance, even though the background music was nothing more than bad elevator tunes. Helen chuckled and told me it was a slow song, not her style. She liked R&B, EDM, and house music, something with a beat. Trying to keep it light, I half-joked about hitting up a Vegas club. To my surprise, she was familiar with some of the popular spots, rattling off names like she'd been there before. I asked how she knew about them, and she mentioned coming to Vegas with a friend for a birthday celebration, exploring the city's nightlife. It wasn't just one visit, she'd been to Vegas multiple times on business as well. It felt like she was showing off, and I couldn't help but think this wasn't what Ron thought he knew. I was starting to see her as a savvy, manipulative woman who knew exactly what she was doing, using Ron as a stepping stone while keeping her true self hidden from him. We decided to check out one of the clubs she mentioned, standing in a long line to get inside. By then, we were both tipsy, and the flirtation between us grew stronger. Once inside, things escalated quickly. We danced close, our hands on each other like we were a couple. At one point, I even crossed a line, touching her more intimately than I should have. She pulled back, suggesting we head back to the hotel before Ron started wondering where she was. It was already around 1 a.m., and she was right. I had an early start the next day, and it wasn't smart to push things further. We left the club and grabbed a cab. In the back seat, things heated up again, and before I knew it, Helen was unzipping me and giving me a blowjob. She didn't seem to care that the driver was sneaking glances at us through the rearview mirror. Just a few blocks from the hotel, the driver half-jokingly told us to cut it out and get a room. Helen stopped, and we composed ourselves as we pulled up to the hotel. Back inside, we rode the elevator up to our floor. For a moment, I thought she might come to my room, but instead, she simply wished me good night and went into the room she shared with Ron. I stayed up that night, unable to stop thinking about what had almost happened. The next morning, I was woken up by a knock on my door. It was the other colleague who had come with us, reminding me that we needed to get to the expo early to set up our booth. It was already past 7 a.m., so I quickly got dressed and headed downstairs, feeling nervous about how Helen would act when I saw her again. When I saw Ron and Helen having breakfast in the hotel restaurant, Helen greeted me like nothing had happened. We were in a rush, so I didn't linger and told them I was heading to the venue to get set up at the expo. Throughout the day, I was busy promoting our products, trying to focus on work. But I couldn't help glancing over at Helen every now and then. She wouldn't make eye contact, and it felt like she was deliberately avoiding me. I started to wonder if the alcohol had played a bigger role than I thought. Maybe she regretted it, felt guilty, or just wanted to forget it ever happened. Later that day, Helen left the expo early, saying she wasn't feeling well. Ron mentioned that she might have been robbed on the street before the expo, which had shaken her up a bit, though she didn't provide much detail. It made me wonder if there was more going on than I knew. I wanted to talk to her to clear the air, but I didn't get the chance. That night, I went to the hotel bar, hoping Helen might be there again, but she wasn't. The next day at the expo, Ron was meeting with a customer, and our other colleague had stepped away, leaving just Helen and me alone at the booth. I knew I needed to say something, but I couldn't find the words. When I finally did manage to speak, I stumbled over my apology. Helen's response was curt and dismissive. "I know it won't happen again." She didn't even look at me, instead turning back to her tasks as if nothing had occurred between us. It was like that entire night had been erased from her mind, or at least, that's how she wanted it to seem. I couldn't tell if she was truly indifferent or if she was burying her feelings about what had happened. The tension between us broke when a visitor approached our booth with questions, snapping us both back into business mode. After that, I felt somewhat relieved that Helen's reaction hadn't been explosive. She had shut down the conversation, but at least it hadn't escalated into something worse. Still, it was awkward, and I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to crossing a line I could never cross. When I returned to the hotel that night, I felt slightly better than I had the previous day, and for the first time in a while, I managed to get a decent night's sleep. The last day of the expo was supposed to be a half day at the booth, followed by some meetings with potential customers. The other colleague and I spent most of the morning arranging for our products to be shipped back home. Ron and Helen visited our booth a couple of times but spent the majority of the day in private meetings with clients. By then, my interactions with Helen were back to normal, professional and devoid of any awkwardness. It was as if the events from 2 nights ago had never happened. At the end of the day, we all shared an Uber ride back to the airport. I sat in the front seat while Ron, Helen, and the other colleague were in the back, chatting and laughing as if everything was perfectly normal. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Ron and Helen looking happy together. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief that nothing had blown up in my face. I realized how narrowly I had avoided a complete disaster. Shortly after the trip, Ron informed me that the upcoming business trip to China had been postponed for reasons I can't exactly recall. I was relieved. I didn't want to spend more time alone with Helen, not after what had almost happened. Meanwhile, Ron and Helen began planning the traditional white wedding she'd always dreamed of. Her parents had finally arrived in the US from China, and the ceremony was set. Most of Ron's employees, including myself, attended the wedding. By this time, my relationship with Ron had shifted from being best friends to a more professional dynamic, boss and employee. I was earning more money than I'd ever thought possible, and with the company's rapid growth, my income was set to double within a year. The business was thriving, and we expanded quickly, hiring 6 more salaried employees. This brought our team to include 3 managers, myself, and 2 others, along with Ron, Helen, 3 engineers, and over 20 hourly workers. Despite all the progress, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling about Ron and Helen's marriage. She wielded significant control over both their household and the company. I kept my interactions with her strictly professional, avoiding anything that might remind us of our previous encounter. I was determined to focus on my work and family, not wanting to jeopardize my marriage or career. Fast forward 2 years, and things were going exceptionally well for the business. I was now earning about $250,000 annually, and my wife and I were expecting our second child. One evening, Ron called me out of the blue, suggesting we meet at a bar. It struck me as unusual. He rarely drank, and we hadn't hung out in a long time. Naturally, I felt anxious about the meeting, wondering if the past with Helen was finally catching up to me. As I drove to the bar, my mind raced with all sorts of scenarios. Maybe Ron had found out. Maybe I was about to lose my job, or worse. But when I arrived and saw Ron sitting there, it was clear the meeting wasn't about me. Ron looked troubled, and it didn't take long for him to open up. He was in a bad spot and needed someone to talk to. Ron explained that his relationship with Helen had been strained for a while. Over the years, she'd tried to isolate him from his friends and family, including me. Her parents, who had come to visit for their wedding, were still living with them, refusing to leave. They were trying to control how their 2-year-old daughter was being raised, which had caused significant tension. Ron struggled with raising his daughter in a multicultural household, especially with Helen's parents undermining him at every turn. I felt deeply for Ron. It wasn't fair for his in-laws to take advantage of his mild-mannered nature. I wanted to tell him to stand up for himself, to demand they leave. But Ron said Helen had already agreed to send them back to China in a few weeks. Still, it was clear their relationship was suffering. Helen seemed to support her parents' presence, believing their strict upbringing had shaped her into who she was and that they provided stability for their daughter while she and Ron frequently traveled for business. As we continued talking, Ron admitted that he and Helen hadn't been intimate in over 4 months. She always had excuses: work stress, their daughter, or sheer exhaustion. He'd even suggested she become a stay-at-home mom, but Helen's ambitions didn't align with that idea. Ron wanted a simpler family life with more kids and less drama, but Helen's desire for control over both their family and the business seemed to be growing. I asked him if he'd ever thought about divorce, suggesting it might allow him to protect his assets and maintain a relationship with his daughter without interference from Helen's family. Ron admitted that he hadn't seriously considered it and hadn't spoken to a lawyer. Instead, he was hoping to suggest marriage counseling to Helen. I didn't discourage him but advised him to have a backup plan. I even suggested monitoring her activities, checking her phone, tracking her movements, maybe even installing a GPS in her car. Ron gave me a look like I was crazy. He dismissed the idea, insisting Helen wasn't the type to have an affair. At that moment, I realized it was best to keep my thoughts to myself. Ron seemed blind to what, to me, was obvious: Helen might be hiding something. It was like he was too smart for his own good, unable to see what was right in front of him. As Ron poured out his troubles, a sudden hailstorm hit outside. The hailstones grew larger, pounding against the bar windows and nearby cars. It felt almost symbolic of the chaos in Ron's life, as if the world outside was mirroring the storm he was going through. I was glad Ron had reached out to me that night. It gave me time to prepare for whatever might happen next. After our conversation at the bar, I noticed Ron's motivation waning. He started showing up at work less often and seemed increasingly detached from the business. His absence was starting to take its toll. Our suppliers were slower to respond, and we lost a few customers. Things were unraveling behind the scenes. One day, after 5 consecutive days of Helen's absence from work, Ron called me and the other managers into his office. He revealed something shocking: Helen had been trying to undermine the business. Using her connections, she had been securing suppliers and clients for her own side venture. Ron anticipated major fallout and warned us that we might have to lay off half of our staff. He instructed me to travel to China and Vietnam to secure new suppliers while he focused on managing the damage on the customer side. After the meeting, Ron pulled me aside and admitted that I had been right all along. After our conversation at the bar, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He'd installed a monitoring app on Helen's phone, and what he found was devastating. Helen had been involved with multiple men she'd met on WeChat. One of them had proposed to her, and she'd accepted. They were planning to move in together, start a business, and eventually marry. Helen planned to use her citizenship, something she'd gained through Ron, to bring the man to the U.S. The messages revealed that Helen had known this man long before she met Ron, possibly even before she moved to the States. Worse, she was plotting to divorce Ron, take control of the business, and start over with her new partner. Her plan had been to wait 5 months before filing for divorce, but Ron's discovery threw everything into chaos. Helen abruptly stopped coming to work, and it became clear that her so-called business trips had been more than just professional engagements. Ron was heartbroken. He admitted that Helen had agreed to attend marriage counseling and even encouraged him to seek individual counseling, all while secretly planning their separation. He told me he'd been feeling deeply depressed, even contemplating suicide. As he spoke, he broke down, and I did my best to comfort him. It was clear that Ron had been bottling up his pain for a long time. I asked about his daughter and whether Helen's parents were still living at his house. Ron told me they had finally left, and he'd hired a babysitter for his daughter. Helen, however, had gone completely off the grid. She wasn't answering Ron's calls or messages. To make matters worse, Helen had been contacting his suppliers and customers, trying to sabotage the business by spreading false information and leaking sensitive documents. Fortunately, some loyal customers tipped Ron off, and while a few suppliers were tempted, the money kept them from severing ties completely. Helen's plan was unraveling, but it wasn't without damage. She managed to sabotage a few supplier relationships in China and Vietnam, but not enough to sink the business entirely. Ron sent me to China on a one-way ticket, unsure of when I'd be back. We were in survival mode, scrambling to keep the business afloat while Helen continued her attempts to dismantle it. During the trip, I managed to restore some of our supply lines. Then, suddenly, Helen stopped contacting the suppliers. I couldn't understand why she'd given up so abruptly, but whatever the reason, it was a welcome relief. When I finally returned to the U.S., it took about a month to stabilize the business. Things eventually returned to a semblance of normalcy, but Ron was never the same. He became more withdrawn, paranoid, and defensive. One day, I asked if he had any news about Helen. He looked at me suspiciously and said, "She abandoned me and our daughter." It was a strange response, given everything we'd been through. A few weeks later, one of our employees told me that a missing persons report had been filed for Helen. Her family claimed they hadn't heard from her in weeks and were worried about her whereabouts. I immediately called Ron, and he confirmed that Helen was missing. The police had questioned him, suspecting foul play. There was no evidence that she had returned to China, and since Ron was the last person known to have seen her, he became the prime suspect. Ron hadn't told the police about Helen's affair, fearing they might use it as a motive against him. He pleaded with me not to mention anything about it either. At that point, I didn't suspect Ron's involvement, nor did I want to. Even if he had been involved, Helen's absence was better for my livelihood, and I was willing to keep my mouth shut. 3 months after Helen's disappearance was reported, I noticed a significant change in Ron. He started to become more outgoing, reaching out to me more often and wanting to hang out. Our business was starting to recover, and I had traveled to East Asia a couple of times to secure our supply lines. I encouraged Ron to join me in social activities, introducing him to my family and taking him out with my military buddies, hoping he might meet someone new. During these outings, I avoided bringing up Helen. She was a thing of the past now. One evening, Ron confided in me about the ongoing situation with Helen's parents and her wealthy uncle. They were constantly in touch with the police, trying to have Ron arrested and claiming he was responsible for Helen's disappearance. However, there was no evidence of any crime, and Ron had been fully cooperative with the investigation, giving the police access to his home and answering all their questions, except, of course, about Helen's affair. From an outsider's perspective, their marriage had seemed solid, and neither had filed for divorce before she went missing. Then, Ron dropped another bombshell. Helen had secretly taken out a substantial life insurance policy on him without his knowledge. This added a new layer of intrigue to the case, leaving everyone puzzled, including the police. There was no clear motive for Ron to have harmed Helen, and the authorities struggled to piece together evidence that could connect him to her disappearance. The police questioned everyone at the company, including me and the other managers, searching for any leads. None of us were inclined to volunteer information that might implicate Ron. If the cops had known about Helen's attempts to sabotage the business and poach employees, it might have given them a motive to pursue charges against Ron. But as far as we knew, they were still grasping at straws. The case remained unsolved for about 5 months until Helen's family in China hired a private investigation team to dig deeper. This team started asking questions, talking to some of our Chinese employees, who eventually confessed that Helen had tried to persuade them to leave the company and join her new venture. They also spoke with some of Helen's friends, who revealed that she had been unhappy in her marriage and expressed a desire to leave Ron. The private investigators compiled enough probable cause to catch the attention of local newspapers, likely funded by Helen's connections back in China. The papers began running stories about Helen's case, putting pressure on the police and the district attorney's office to take action. It wasn't long before the investigators unearthed more information, including records of Helen's travels, purchases, and transcripts of her conversations with various individuals, including her affair partner. The increased scrutiny put pressure on some of our employees, who were then brought in for questioning. Eventually, one of them let slip that before Helen's disappearance, Ron had informed me and the 2 other managers about her attempts to undermine the company. This revelation led to my trip to China to fix the damage. When the police called me in for interrogation, I had my lawyer present and refused to answer any questions that could incriminate me. They were pushing hard, trying to pin something on me due to my close connection with Ron and Helen. The cops tried to intimidate me, calling me a suspect and an accessory to a crime. They even hinted that my decision to bring a lawyer was a sign of guilt. Part of me wondered if Ron had been involved in Helen's disappearance, but I wasn't about to entertain that thought publicly. Eventually, the police backed off, unable to get a statement from me. They resorted to petty tactics, briefly arresting me and showing up at my workplace to make their presence known. I don't know all the details, but at some point, they managed to get a warrant to search Ron's house again and seized some items. Pictures of Helen were plastered on bulletin boards all over town, and it was widely assumed that she was dead. The police appealed to the public for information leading to an arrest, offering a reward for any tips. The investigation dragged on for another 6 months, with the media constantly hounding us at work, looking for statements. The relentless attention took a toll on our employees, and we ended up losing some good people because of it. 6 months later, the situation finally began to settle down. I continued spending time with Ron during this period, and there was an unspoken understanding between us. We both knew I suspected his involvement in Helen's disappearance, but neither of us ever said it out loud. I rationalized my silence, telling myself that Helen had tried to jeopardize my livelihood, my family's well-being, and the company I had worked so hard to help build. Whatever had happened to her, I felt she'd brought it upon herself. After those 6 long months, the district attorney decided not to take the case to trial. The evidence against Ron was mostly circumstantial, with no solid proof that could guarantee a conviction. They worried that trying the case with what they had might lead to an acquittal, and if new evidence came to light later, the whole thing could fall apart. So, they opted to wait, placing the case on the back burner in the cold case section. The business started to bounce back, and for a while, it seemed like we had weathered the worst of it. But about a year later, while I was at the airport about to board an international flight, my wife called, practically yelling at me to turn on the local news. I tried to tell her I was at the airport, but she insisted on sharing the news herself. She told me that 2 weeks earlier, human remains had been discovered in a remote area, likely disturbed by animals. Among the findings was a skull, which dental records confirmed belonged to Helen. My heart sank. I immediately canceled my travel plans and tried to get in touch with Ron, but he wasn't answering his phone. Eventually, Ron's lawyer reached out to me, explaining that Ron had been arrested. His bail was set at $300,000, and we posted it as soon as the judge allowed it. When I finally spoke with Ron, he confessed that it had been an accident. According to Ron, Helen had told him she was planning to leave him and take their daughter back to China. Things got heated, and during a scuffle, Helen hit her head against the wall and collapsed. She regained consciousness but refused to go to the hospital, so Ron helped her onto the couch, gave her a blanket, and left her to rest. He hoped she would recover by the next morning, but when he checked on her the next day, she was dead. Blood had oozed from the back of her head. The coroner's report confirmed a minor skull fracture and blunt force trauma, but there was no definitive cause of death. Ron said he panicked, unsure of what to do. After a lengthy trial, Ron was convicted of second-degree manslaughter, with the jury recommending a sentence of over 20 years in prison. As of now, he's served 3 months, and we're working on an appeal. Ron transferred most of the business to me, and I've committed to supporting him financially while he's in prison. On top of that, I'm now tangled up in a custody battle with Helen's parents, trying to adopt their 5-year-old daughter. She's grown close to my kids, and Ron wants her to be raised in our home, believing we can provide the loving environment she deserves. So here I am, juggling the business, legal battles, and the fallout of decisions that spiraled far beyond anything I ever imagined. The business is stable, and I've managed to keep most of the staff motivated through the chaos. Financially, we're thriving, but the emotional weight of everything lingers, shaping how I approach my work, my family, and my relationships. The custody battle for Ron and Helen's daughter has been anything but simple. Helen's parents, along with her wealthy uncle, are adamantly fighting for custody. They argue that their granddaughter should be raised within their culture and family, citing Ron's conviction as proof that he can't provide a stable environment for her, even from prison. I'm doing everything I can to convince the court otherwise. Ron's daughter has already bonded with my children, and my wife and I are committed to giving her the love and support she needs. It's a strange position to be in, fighting for a child who isn't mine by blood, but whom I feel a deep sense of responsibility toward. She's innocent in all of this, caught in a web of betrayal, ambition, and tragedy. Ron, for all his faults, truly wants what's best for her, and I'll do my best to honor that. As for the business, it has become my lifeline, both financially and emotionally. The skills I've developed, the network I've built, and the lessons I've learned have given me a new sense of purpose. I owe much of that to Ron, despite the complexities of our friendship. I think about him often, his intelligence, his loyalty, and the way he put his trust in the wrong person. The man I knew years ago might have been naive, but he didn't deserve the betrayal that destroyed his life. There are moments when I reflect on the choices I've made, the lines I've crossed, and the secrets I've kept. I wonder if I could have done more to protect Ron or prevent Helen's schemes from escalating. But then I remind myself that life doesn't hand out clear answers. Sometimes, you just do the best you can with what you're given. Ron's daughter will grow up someday and learn the truth about her parents. When that time comes, I hope she'll see that, in the midst of all the chaos, there were people who fought to give her a better future. And as for me, I'll continue walking the tightrope of responsibility and redemption, knowing that every decision I make now is for the sake of my family, Ron's legacy, and the little girl who deserves a chance at a normal life.